Title, she returned after years and found her past waiting in the snow-covered silence. The first snowfall of the year covered the city in white, quieting the usual noise of honking cars and hurried footsteps. Park Ji-hyun stepped out of the bookstore, the scent of old paper clinging to her coat as her breath fogged in the cold air. The city had changed, its skyline now dominated by glass towers and neon signs. Yet certain things remained untouched. The way the snow softened the edges of the world. The way winter still smelled of roasted chestnuts from street vendors. She walked through familiar streets, her boots crunching over the snow. It had been years since she had come back to this neighborhood. The past had a way of lingering, no matter how far she had gone. The old hanok stood at the end of the narrow road, its tiled roof heavy with snow, just as she remembered it. A single light flickered from the window, casting a glow that seeped into the frost-covered wood. She hesitated before pushing open the door, her fingers grazing the familiar grain. Inside, the scent of pine wood and aged soy paste filled the air. The house had been left untouched, as if waiting for her return. Dust gathered along the edges of framed photographs on the wall. She traced her fingers over one, a younger version of herself standing beside her father. The image felt like a fragment of another life, a time before she had left in search of something she could no longer define. She placed her bags down and walked deeper into the house. The small sewing kit her mother used still rested on the wooden table, untouched. The silence pressed in, not empty, but heavy with the weight of all that had once been. In the kitchen, she turned on the gas stove, watching as the blue flame flickered to life. The kettle whistled softly, steam curling into the dimly lit room. She reached for an old ceramic mug, its rim chipped from years of use, and poured herself a cup of barley tea. The warmth seeped into her hands as she stood in the stillness. Moving to the study, she ran her fingers along the spines of her father's books. Their pages had yellowed with time, but they remained as he had left them. She pulled out an old poetry collection, flipping through its pages. The words, once recited to her in the quiet hours of winter nights, now carried a different weight. The past was not just a memory, it was a presence, lingering in the scent of paper, in the creak of the floorboards, in the cold air pressing against the windows. Snow continued to fall outside, dusting the wooden porch in white. She pressed her palm against the cold windowpane, watching as the wind sent delicate flakes swirling into the night. The years she had spent away came back to her in fragments. Missed calls, unanswered messages, and the quiet resentment that had settled between her and the home she had abandoned. Regret did not announce itself loudly. It crept in through the spaces left unspoken, settling in the corners of familiar rooms. That night, she lay beneath thick blankets listening to the house shift with the wind. The walls creaked, the wooden beams settling under the weight of the years. Sleep came slowly, the quiet enveloping her like a memory she could not escape. Morning arrived with a pale, golden light filtering through the frost-covered windows. The world outside had been remade overnight, the streets softened by a fresh layer of snow. She stepped onto the porch, her breath rising in the crisp air. The town remained unchanged, yet something in her had shifted. It was no longer a place she needed to escape, but one she could return to without fear. She took a slow breath, letting the cold settle in her lungs. The past was not meant to be outrun. It was meant to be carried forward, woven into the fabric of who she had become. As she walked down the snow-covered path, she knew she would return, not as someone seeking to leave, but as someone ready to remember. The morning air was crisp as Ji-hyun walked through the narrow alleyways, the old stone paths familiar beneath her boots. The scent of freshly baked bread from the corner shop drifted in the air, stirring memories of childhood mornings when she would run down these very streets, her father's voice calling after her, telling her not to stray too far. The town had not changed much, yet the weight of time made everything feel different. The past clung to the walls, to the aged storefronts, to the murmurs of vendors as they set up their stalls. At the marketplace, vendors arranged neatly bundled vegetables and steaming fish cakes sizzling on skewers over hot coals. She lingered near a stall selling tteokbokki, the rich scent of gochujang sauce tugging at something deep within her. Her mother had once brought her here after school, handing her a paper cup filled with rice cakes as they sat on a bench watching the passers-by. Those were simpler times, when love was measured in small gestures, in the way her mother wiped stray sauce from the corner of her lips. Now she stood alone, the warmth of nostalgia mixing with the cold air that bit at her skin. She wandered further, past familiar storefronts, before stopping in front of a small cafe tucked between an old bookstore and a florist. The cafe had changed ownership, but the structure remained the same wooden door, the same lantern hanging just above it. She hesitated before stepping inside. The bell above the door chimed softly as she entered, the scent of roasted coffee beans filling the air. A young barista greeted her, and she offered a polite nod before choosing a seat near the window. The cafe was quiet, only a few patrons scattered across the space. She wrapped her hands around a warm cup of black coffee, gazing outside as snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky. The past had a way of creeping into the present, filling spaces she had once left empty. As she sipped the bitter drink, she allowed herself to sit with the memories, to let them settle rather than push them away. But the quiet moment did not last long. The door chimed again. She barely glanced up, but a sudden presence near her table drew her attention. A man, tall and dressed in a black wool coat dusted with fresh snow, took the seat opposite her without a word. A moment passed before she recognized him. Han Jun-seo. The years had been kind to him. His sharp features softened only slightly, but his dark eyes still held the quiet intensity she remembered. She looked away, gripping her cup tighter. The air between them crackled with something unspoken, something unresolved. It had been years since she had last seen him, since they had parted ways without closure. The cafe's warmth felt stifling, her breath shallow as memories surfaced. Whispers beneath streetlights, the ghost of a smile in the cold, the warmth of his hand in hers before she had let go. Jun-seo finally broke the silence, his voice lower than she remembered, but steady. He asked about her return, about her father's house. There was no bitterness in his tone, only quiet curiosity. She gave short answers, unwilling to open the door to a past that had remained locked for so long. But he remained, sipping his coffee, his presence unwavering. The snowfall outside grew heavier and minutes stretched into something longer. Neither of them moved to leave. Perhaps it was the weight of nostalgia, or perhaps neither wanted to be the first to end the fragile moment that had formed between them. When she finally stood, he followed, stepping outside with her. The cold air rushed between them, but he did not move away. Their footsteps crunched against the fresh snow as they walked side by side, neither speaking, as if testing the space between them. The old bookstore, the one they had once visited together on rainy afternoons, still stood at the corner of the street. She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. He followed. The scent of aged paper and ink surrounded them as they wandered through the aisles. She ran her fingers along the worn book spines, remembering the way he used to tease her for reading the same poetry collection over and over. She found it on the shelf, pulling it out without thinking. He took a step closer, glancing at the book in her hands. He remembered. She could tell by the way his expression softened, by the way his fingers almost reached out before pulling back. The moment stretched between them, fragile yet heavy with meaning. He asked if she still read poetry. She hesitated before nodding. They left the bookstore together, the snow now thick enough to blanket the streets in white. As they walked, he mentioned an old cafe they used to visit, the one by the river. It was still there, he told her, as if offering a bridge between the past and present. She said nothing, but her steps slowed. He noticed. She allowed herself to follow him through the winding streets, past old houses with light glowing softly through their windows. The river was partially frozen, reflecting the golden light of the street lamps. The cafe stood just as it had all those years ago, the wooden sign slightly more worn but still welcoming. Inside, the scent of cinnamon and warm pastries filled the air. They found a corner seat, much like they used to, and for the first time that evening, Ji-hyun let herself look at him. Truly look. The sharp lines of his face, the way his hands curled slightly against the ceramic mug, and the way his gaze lingered on her as if trying to memorize something he had once known by heart. Memories poured in, their late-night talks, the way he used to tuck loose strands of her hair behind her ear, the way he once made her laugh so easily. Time had separated them, had pulled them apart like a cruel tide. But sitting across from him now, she wondered if it had ever truly erased what had been there. Junso spoke of his life, of the years they had lost. He had left the city too, had chased dreams he once thought impossible. There was a hesitation in his words, a carefulness, as if he did not want to reveal too much. She understood. They were both standing at the edges of something delicate, something that could shatter if touched too quickly. The night stretched on, and the weight of time between them lessened, just slightly. When they finally stepped outside, the streets were empty, the world quiet beneath its blanket of snow. She shivered slightly, and without thinking, he shrugged off his scarf, wrapping it gently around her neck. The touch was brief, but it sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fabric. She hesitated. Then, before she could stop herself, she reached up, adjusting the scarf slightly. A small, almost imperceptible smile crossed his lips. It was nothing, and yet it was everything. As they reached the turn where their paths would split, he paused. She did too. He met her gaze, and for the first time in years, she did not look away. The crisp night air surrounded them, carrying the weight of unspoken words. The streets were empty, the city hushed beneath a thick layer of snow. Jihyun clutched the scarf Junso had wrapped around her, the lingering warmth from his touch settling against her skin. The moment stretched, their eyes locked in a silent conversation neither dared to voice. She should have said goodbye then. Should have turned, walked away, let the past remain untouched. But the way he looked at her, his expression a mixture of longing and uncertainty, made it impossible to move. 1,000 memories swirled between them, all the moments they had once shared pressing in on her like the cold air around them. Junso took a step closer. It was subtle, hesitant, as if waiting to see if she would retreat. She didn't. Her breath was visible in the winter air, mingling with his as he reached up, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. His fingers barely grazed her skin, but the touch sent a shiver through her, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something unspoken, yet undeniable. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, the distant hum of the city fading into the background. Jihyun's heart pounded in her chest, and she knew that if she stayed any longer, if she let this moment stretch even further, she would no longer be able to hold back the feelings she had spent years trying to bury. Instead, she turned away, her fingers tightening around the scarf. The warmth of it was suffocating now, a reminder of something she could not afford to indulge in. She took a step back, but before she could say something to break the spell, he spoke. His voice was quiet, uncertain, yet filled with something that made her chest tighten. He asked if she would walk with him, just for a little while longer. The part of her that had spent years learning to protect herself screamed for her to refuse. But another part, one that had never truly let go, nodded before she could stop herself. They walked side by side through the silent streets, past the old buildings and glowing street lamps. Snow crunched beneath their boots, and for a while, neither of them spoke. It was strange how easy it was to fall into step with him again, as if no time had passed at all. As if the years apart had been nothing but a long dream, and now they were waking up, finding themselves in the same place they had once left behind. They reached a park near the river, the benches covered in a thin layer of snow. Jihyun hesitated before sitting down, brushing off the surface before settling onto the cold wood. Junso followed, his presence beside her both comforting and terrifying. She could feel him watching her, waiting for her to say something, but she didn't know where to begin. Instead, he spoke first. He told her about the years they had spent apart, not in detail, but in fragments, in quiet admissions of missed opportunities and lonely nights. He had left the city and had thrown himself into work, but no matter how far he went, he had never truly been able to forget her. There had always been moments, fleeting, unexpected, where something would remind him of her. A song is playing in a cafe, the scent of jasmine in the summer air. The sight of someone with long dark hair walking ahead of him on a busy street. Each time his heart would stutter, as if waiting for the impossible. Ji-hyun listened in silence, her fingers tracing patterns in the frost that had gathered on the bench. She wanted to tell him that she had felt the same, that she had tried to move on, had tried to convince herself that their love had been a passing thing, a fleeting moment in time that could not have lasted. But no matter how many years passed, no matter how many times she told herself it was over, the memories had never faded. They had only grown sharper, more vivid, until they became something she could no longer ignore. She finally spoke, her voice softer than she intended. She told him about her life since they had parted, about the nights spent alone in a city that no longer felt like home, about the way she had convinced herself that she was better off without him. But as the words left her lips, she realized how hollow they sounded, because the truth was, she had never been better off without him. She had only been surviving, existing in a world that felt colder without his presence. Junso reached for her hand then, his fingers hesitating for a moment before finally closing around hers. His touch was warm, steady, grounding her in a way she had not felt in years. She did not pull away. Instead, she let herself lean into it, let herself feel the weight of his presence, the undeniable pull of something she had tried for so long to deny. The wind stirred around them, carrying with it the scent of winter and something else, something fragile yet full of promise. Ji-hyun turned to look at him, really look at him, and in that moment, she saw not the boy she had once loved, but the man he had become. A man who had been shaped by time and distance, by heartache and longing, yet who still looked at her as if she was the only thing that had ever truly mattered. Her heart ached with the weight of it all, the years they had lost, the love they had left behind. But sitting there, in the quiet of the night, she realized that perhaps it was not too late, that perhaps, despite everything, they could find their way back to each other. Junso lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles, his breath warm against her skin. The gesture was small, almost hesitant, but it was enough. Enough to tell her that he was still waiting, that he would wait for as long as it took. Ji-hyun let out a breath she had not realized she had been holding. And then, for the first time in years, she smiled. The past could not be erased. The years apart could not be undone. But perhaps, just perhaps, they could start again. The morning sun cast a pale glow over the city, its golden rays filtering through the window of Ji-hyun's apartment. The quiet hum of the city was distant, muffled by the weight pressing against her chest. She sat still, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the coffee cup in her hands. The once steaming liquid had long gone cold, much like the fragile hope she had allowed herself to nurture in the past few days. Her mind replayed the night before in haunting detail, the stolen glances, the unspoken promises, the quiet warmth of his hand in hers, the fear in his eyes. Junso had walked beside her through the near-empty streets, their steps slow and measured, as if time itself had finally given them the chance to breathe. The neon lights reflected off the pavement, casting shifting colors across their faces. There had been no words exchanged, but none were needed. The silence was comfortable, almost sacred, as if speaking aloud would break whatever fragile peace they had managed to reclaim. But fate had never been kind to them. Ji-hyun had felt it before she knew what was coming. A sense of foreboding, a quiet whisper at the back of her mind that warned her that happiness was fleeting, that love never stayed in her grasp for long. Even as they reached her apartment, as Junso pulled her into his arms, the moment felt borrowed, like something that didn't truly belong to them. The morning came too quickly. The sharp trill of his phone cut through the quiet space they had shared, sending a chill through Ji-hyun before she even saw the tension in his shoulders. He sat on the edge of the bed, his hand gripping the phone so tightly, his knuckles turned white. The voice on the other end of the call was inaudible to her, but she knew. She knew from the way his body stiffened, from the way his breath caught in his throat. Something was wrong. When he finally turned to her, there was an apology in his gaze, a resignation. She didn't ask him to stay, even though everything inside her screamed for her to do so. Junso had always been pulled away by forces stronger than love. She had learned long ago that pleading wouldn't change that. And so she simply stood there, watching as he kissed her one last time, soft, lingering, as if trying to carve the memory of her into his soul before he walked out the door. The space he left behind felt empty, hollow in a way that made Ji-hyun wrap her arms around herself to stop the trembling. A suffocating dread settled over her as the hours passed. The city moved forward, but time felt slow, dragging her into an endless spiral of worry. She told herself she was being irrational, that he would come back, just as he always had. But some part of her refused to believe it. Then came the call. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but the moment she answered, her world tilted. A stranger's voice, calm and clinical, delivered the words that shattered everything. There had been an accident, a collision on an icy road, a truck, a sudden swerve, the sound of metal crushing metal. The impact had been severe. Junso had been rushed to the hospital, but the damage was grave. She didn't remember how she got there. One moment she was in her apartment, the next she was running through the sterile white halls of the hospital, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The smell of antiseptic burned her nose. The fluorescent lights above her head blurred into streaks. Every step felt heavy, her legs moving as if through water, but she forced herself forward. The doctors spoke in hushed tones, their words a meaningless hum of medical jargon that barely registered. Internal bleeding, critical condition, slim chances of survival. Words that struck like blades, yet none cut deeper than the sight of him lying motionless in the hospital bed, his body tangled in a mess of wires and tubes. The room was quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of the monitors, a cruel reminder that his heart was still fighting, still holding on despite everything. Ji-hyun stood frozen, her fingers gripping the cold metal railing of the bed. The strong hands that had once held hers so tightly were now pale and limp against the sheets. The lips that had kissed her with such longing now barely moved as he struggled to breathe. Her hands trembled as she reached out, her fingers tracing the curve of his cheek, the warmth already slipping away from his skin. She wanted to say something, to fill the silence with anything other than the sound of the machines keeping him alive. But no words came, only silent prayers that went unanswered. The minutes stretched into eternity. Junso stirred slightly, his eyelids fluttering open just enough for her to see the faint glimmer of recognition in his eyes. He was in pain. It was written in every strained breath, every slight twitch of his fingers. Yet, even in his suffering, he searched for her, his gaze softening when he found her face. He tried to move, tried to reach for her, but the effort was too much. The weight of his injuries held him down, tethering him to the cruel reality of their fate. Ji-hyun grasped his hand, pressing it against her chest as if willing him to feel the heartbeat that still raced for him. She wanted to freeze this moment, to hold on to him just a little longer, but the machines began to wail, a sound that sent ice through her veins. Doctors rushed in, their voices urgent, their movements quick and precise. Hands pulled her away, forcing her back as they fought to keep him tethered to life. She wanted to scream, to beg them to save him, to plead with whatever cruel force in the universe that had brought him back to her only to rip him away again. But she could do nothing. Nothing except watch as his body arched in response to their desperate attempts, as the rhythmic beeping turned into a single, continuous tone. The world collapsed in an instant. A void opened inside her, swallowing everything, every hope, every dream, every whispered promise of a future they would never have. The sound of muffled voices, of apologies spoken in hushed tones, barely reached her ears. Her gaze remained fixed on him, on the stillness that had overtaken his body. He was gone, just like that, as if he had never been there at all. The funeral came too soon. The sky was gray, the wind biting against her skin as she stood motionless beside his grave. The weight of finality pressed down on her, suffocating, unbearable. People spoke around her, offering condolences she barely registered. The words meant nothing. Nothing could mean anything anymore. As the first handful of dirt hit the coffin, something inside her broke. The tears she had been holding back slipped past her defenses, falling silently down her cheeks. She stood there long after the others had left, unable to turn away, unable to accept that this was all that was left of him. A name carved into stone, a memory slipping through her fingers like sand. Time lost meaning after that. The world continued, indifferent to her grief. The streets they had walked together felt emptier. The places they had shared held only echoes of a past she could never return to. She retraced their memories, revisiting every moment as if searching for him in the remnants of their love. But he was nowhere, just a ghost lingering in the spaces he once filled. Winter came, bringing the first snowfall of the season. Ji-hyun stood by the river, watching the flakes drift down, disappearing as they touched the water's surface. The cold bit at her skin, but she barely noticed. She closed her eyes, and for a brief moment, she could almost feel his presence beside her, hear the faint whisper of his voice carried by the wind. She let out a breath, watching it dissipate into the air, taking with it the last fragments of a love that had never been meant to last. She whispered his name one last time, knowing it would be carried away, lost to the winter breeze. And as the snow fell heavier, she finally turned away, walking forward into a future without him, leaving only footprints that would soon be covered by the falling white.